So hello again to everybody on the call just joining us now. I am Reagan Kinney of TBK Creative, and welcome to Web Accessibility and the Law, the 10 most common web accessibility, the 10 most common web accessibility issues addressed, presented by TBK Creative. Now, TBK Creative builds websites that source a brand's greatness and further performs digital marketing programs and consulting services for companies across Canada. The event today is sponsored by AOTA Online, Ontario's web accessibility software. And your presenters today are Andrew Schiestel and Andre Lafort. Andrew Schiestel is the president at TBK Creative and AOTA Online. Andrew's a 5-time international award-winning digital marketer, an award-winning entrepreneur, a columnist for the London Free Press, and in 2013, Business London magazine named Andrew to their 20 under 40 list, which recognizes industry leaders under the age of 40 who give back to their community. Andrew speaks and consults across Ontario on web design, digital marketing, content marketing, and web accessibility. Joining Andrew today is Andre Lafort, the VP of Technology at TBK Creative and AOTA Online. Andrew Lafort graduated from Western University with his software engineering degree. He has over 15 years professional software development experience. And previous to joining TBK Creative, Andre worked as a senior developer at 3M for 7 years, where he worked on large projects such as the development of the company's current international B2B e-commerce site. So welcome, Andre and Andrew. We're ready to get started.
Thank you, Reagan, for that very nice introduction. Welcome, everybody, to the call. I know there are some new names that we see here, which I'm excited to, I'm excited for you guys, and I'm excited that you're here to talk, to learn more about web accessibility and more about the AOTA regulation that pertains to web. And I also see some names that are familiar. We did a webinar like this back in April, so welcome back to the call if you did join that webinar in April. In terms of content, to give everybody a bit of a vision for where we're going on this call. Andre, if you're able to go to the table of contents slide.
It should already be there.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, everybody. I had the wrong screen up. I had my PowerPoint up, and I'm like, why is it not moving right now? It's because I wasn't actually pressing the button. All right. So compartmentalize into 4 sections. We're gonna do a bit of a duplicate piece for everybody around the current AODA regulation, which is the Integrated Accessibility Standard, the regulation that affects the web, because that's a really important piece, and I know many of you are here to understand that. So we're gonna go over some of the most commonly asked questions about that regulation on how it pertains to the web. Andre is going to really dive into some frequently asked questions, probably the most frequently asked questions that he and the team receives in regards to web accessibility and WCAG 2.0. Then what Andre is going to do is he's going to leave the PowerPoint software here, and he's going to go into a web browser, and he's going to actually start going to some websites, because I think what a lot of us want to know more of when we start to learn about web accessibility is, show me the examples. So Andre's going to do that. He's going to go to certain sites, and he's going to speak about certain issues that he sees with certain websites consistent with the WCAG 2.0, and provide whatever instructions make sense to repair those to have them comply with that particular guideline. And they're going to be the more common ones that Andre sees. And then we're going to open it up. We have till 2:30 today, so we'll probably be through those first 3 sections by around 2-ish, give or take. So it's going to give us some time for a Q&A period. And I really do encourage that. Reagan said at the start you can certainly ask questions, and I really encourage that. Feel free at any point in time to type messages to us, questions that you have that pertains to this content. We may not be able to get to each question as it's coming in, but it can certainly create some fodder for the Q&A period at the end. So we'd love to hear your questions as we go along, and we want to make this valuable for you. So if there's a piece that sort of 70–80% there for you, but you're like, well, what about this one scenario? Please go ahead and ask it, and we'll do our best to answer that question for you. Okay. As Reagan pointed out, the event today is brought to you by AODA Online. So I want to take about 30 seconds, and I want to shine a spotlight on the software, as it is our sponsor here today. AODA Online is an enterprise-level software. It's used by developers across Ontario and content producers, and it is cloud-based, so it's online, and it really exists to assist groups who have websites, assist groups in having those websites meet the HTML WCAG 2.0 guidelines. So it crawls a site, points out errors for you consistent with the WCAG 2.0 guidelines, and provides repair instructions. So it removes a little bit of the human error, speeds up the process for everybody, and there's a lot of education that happens for your web teams as you're using a software like AODA Online. So if interested in checking out AODA Online, you can find it at aodaonline.com, and there is a free scanner that you can activate on 25 pages if you want to do a scan and see how your website is faring, so feel free to use that. Okay, thanks for that, and let's dive into the content. So back to the table of contents, we see the first section here would be understanding the Act. A couple items here to sort of preempt the section. What we're going to be speaking about applies to public sector, not-for-profit sector, and private sector groups. For the sake of time, and focusing the talk somewhere specifically, we're leaving out government, and I don't know if any government groups had registered anyways for the talk, but I want you to know that this is specific to the public sector, not-for-profit, private sector group operating here in Ontario. All these answers you're going to see have been verified with the Accessibility Directorate of Ontario. And as such, because we're not the Accessibility Directorate of Ontario, and because we're not a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, it's to be taken as education and not legal advice. Okay. Okay. So we get this question a lot from groups. Am I obligated under the regulation, and when? And maybe I'm gonna let me just step back just briefly too on this when I speak about regulation. So just a broader understanding of how regulation and Act play together. So there's the Act itself, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the AODA. The AODA has 5 major pillars at this point that the ministry has identified that are of importance to making Ontario accessible and fulfilling on that vision. Things such as built environment, customer service, information communication, employment. These are some of the pillars. When we speak about web, that falls in one of those 5 pillars. That falls into information communication. And so what often happens in Canada is when they produce an act, they then produce regulations. Regulations are more of the specific guidelines for following legislation, and speaks about what you have to do by when, fines if you don't comply. It creates some rules for companies, and it creates some rules for a group like a ministry to follow to enforce the act. So so far we're in the second regulation under the AODA. The first was customer service standard. You're probably familiar with the customer service standard. We're now in the integrated accessibility standard, and a big part of the integrated accessibility standard pertains to building websites and maintaining websites that are more accessible for people with physical disabilities. And so you would go to section 14 to learn more about that. And so we get the question, okay, so am I obligated and when? And here's a good way to break this down, this section. if you, under this section, if you're a public sector operating in Ontario, or if you're a large organization operating in Ontario, you are what's considered an obligated organization. A large organization in the regulation is defined as over 50 employees. Okay, so that creates what is an obligated organization, and then we get to the next part, which would be, well, by when? You know, when do I have to have a website or websites that are more barrier-free? We had a deadline pass under that regulation, Jan 1, 2014, and what it basically said is, if you're an obligated organization, I'm paraphrasing based on the regulation in front of us here. This is copy and pasted. If you are an obligated organization, so public sector or large organization, if on Jan 1, 2014 or later, you build a new website and the content on that site, it must conform to WCAG 2.0 Level A. Andre is going to get in pretty thoroughly about what WCAG 2.0 is, but in a nutshell, it is a third-party set of guidelines that was developed by a third-party group called W3C that provides instructions to developers on how to build websites and maintain web content that is more accessible for people with physical disabilities. So, Jan 1, 2014, if you're going to build a new website and if you're an obligated organization, you need to make sure that it meets WCAG 2.0 Level A. The next big guideline is Jan 1, 2021, and this still applies to obligated organizations, public sector, large organization, and it's all internet websites that is under your control. It must meet WCAG 2.0 Level AA, whether it's new or not. So that's an important distinction there, whether it's new or not. You can see now it's all versus new in the previous subsection. And then the other piece that actually in our conversations we find gets overlooked a lot because it's a little bit further down in this section, in section 14, is that the section applies to web content published on a website after Jan 1, 2012. So it's not that there is no retroactiveness here. It's not that there isn't retroactiveness, because there actually is. It's that when your site has to meet WCAG 2.0, whether that's now if you're building a new site or as of Jan 1, 2021, then all web content on that site published after Jan 1, 2012 needs to meet that level of WCAG 2.0. Okay. Let's go to the second question. And this was actually answered in my previous answer. So large organization as defined by the regulation is 50 or more employees in Ontario. They're very specific about that. And we've had this question before. If my company is based outside of Ontario, but we have over 50 employees working in Ontario. So you can think here possibly retailers, restaurant chains, like hotel, like hospitality, tech companies. There's some California companies with offices in Kitchener-Waterloo area, Toronto obviously. Your company would be an obligated organization still if you have over 50 employees working on Ontario under the AODA. What's a new internet website? As defined by the regulation, a new internet website means either a website with a new domain name or a website with an existing domain name undergoing a significant refresh. So I think the first two pieces there are pretty explanatory. I think the significant refresh is the one that we all kind of, say, well, what does that mean? What constitutes a significant refresh? And I've asked the ADO about that, which is the next slide. So what is a significant refresh? And these bullet points are copy and pasted from one of their subpages. And so what they say is a new look and feel to the website, a change in how users navigate around it, a major update and change to the content of the website. I asked on the phone if there's anything that would then quantify, because this does make sense, but is there anything to quantify what is a significant refresh? And what I was told, and I'm paraphrasing, as a rule of thumb, 50%. Question 6, how does my company's intranet apply? If you're a public sector or private sector under the current regulation, it doesn't. Governments in that section, section 14 under the regulation, has some obligations, but nowhere in the regulation does it say that your intranet applies. It doesn't mean it's not a good idea if you have staff members or may have staff members in the future who have certain physical disabilities. But in terms of like a legislative regulation perspective, nothing in the current regulation for public sector and private sector addresses obligations around your intranet. I think this is a great question. How does my company's customer portal apply? Example, online banking. If you're a college and university, I know there's some of those from people from that sector on the call today, such as a student portal. It's password protected. What does the regulation say? I had a conversation on the phone with the ADO about this specific question. According to the ADO, it doesn't, the regulation for public sector, private sector, it doesn't apply to customer portals. The reason is they consider that an extranet, not an intranet website. This is another good question. I have a third-party feed on my website, and nowadays a lot of websites do. It's not WCAG 2.0 accessible. Like, there's something about it that you just know. It's missing one of the guidelines. So the question becomes, well, okay, I have this third-party feed. Am I contravening the act? In many cases, you're not. According to the same section 14, and let's break this down here the best that we can. This section applies to websites and web content. So it states this section applies to websites and web content, including web-based applications. So let's create an example. So let's say you have a Twitter feed on your website. That's your third-party feed. And so yes, it's a web-based application, so it would apply. Then the next part of this says that an organization controls directly. In that case, you wouldn't control your Twitter feed directly, like the actual, like the programmatic side of it. You might be able to provide content within it, but not the actual widget itself. So you don't really control it directly. You would have a contractual relationship to some degree with Twitter if you're using their widget. But it probably doesn't allow for the modification of that product, that web application. So that's an example where a third-party feed would not apply. But, oh, sorry, Andre.
Right back there to that.
That's all good. But what you want to do here is you want to litmus test this. So you want to ask those questions. Is it web-based? Do I control it? Do I have a contractual relationship with, let's say, the author or the copyright holder? And does that relationship, that contractual relationship, allow for the modification of the product? So it's a bit of a litmus test with 4 sections to it. What penalties and fines can exist? The Act does allow for the enforcement of the legislation. And the director of the ADO has the authority to issue penalties for noncompliance. These can include $200 to $2,000 for an individual or unincorporated organization, $500 to $15,000 for corporations, and daily amounts can apply in the most serious cases. So in terms of how our groups can be fined, how much, etc., this is up to the ADO, obviously. What I can tell you is that we just completed the customer service reporting last December, and that was the first regulation to be rolled out. And So if there was to be, any kind of enforcement, it's very likely they would start with customer service. And now we're into the integrated accessibility standard, which would cover the web. And I believe reporting for that will be December, I believe. And so I'm speculating a little bit. I just want to, disclose that. I'm speculating a little bit because I'm not the ADO. But it would probably be after the reporting period for the integrated accessibility standard, which I believe is this December. All right, Andre, take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew, again, thank you for covering those topics. Even as someone in this space, it's always great to be present to those topics once again.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So everyone, what I'm going to start with today is a list of questions that are asked very often of myself and my team. And we feel that it would be of benefit to the general public if we covered these off in a quick fashion, kind of help maybe answer some questions you have as well. So let's get started. Well, the first question we get often, and Andrew alluded to this earlier, is what exactly is the WCAG 2.0? I know that the Act and the regulations mention it and say that I must comply with it, but what exactly is it? So, in short, WCAG is an acronym, stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it's a set of guidelines and recommendations that provide guidance to developers, content producers, authors, editors, to make sure that their content is accessible and reduces the likelihood of barriers. Now, beyond that question, we also get asked, well, the regulations refer to WCAG 2.0. Do these get updated often, if at all, and how do I stay on top of updates? What I can state is that the W3C says clearly that the WCAG version 2 is a stable set of guidelines, and those recommendations will not change. Something I'd like to mention is there was a WCAG version 1.0. It was released just before the millennium. A few years later, they introduced WCAG 2.0, mostly because the web had evolved so much that what had been placed within version 1 wasn't as applicable and had some gaps in it. So that version 2 came out and has been out for 5 or 6 years now, I believe, and is considered a stable set of these guidelines. Question 3, Andrew alluded to these terms earlier in one of his questions, is this concept of level A, level AA, and level AAA. What are they and what's the difference between these? So consider it a 3-tiered compliance level, where level A is very basic compliance, and all the way up to AAA, where in AAA the intent is truly to remove any barriers that might exist to folks navigating the web with a disability. Something else to keep in mind is by becoming AA compliant, you've also had to become level A compliant. So as we progress over time towards that AA compliance in Jan 1st, 2021, the work you're doing today to be level A compliant is not lost. We're going to build upon that within AA. So something else that I get asked very often is, Andre, a lot of these guidelines are very technical. What can I provide my non-technical staff as far as techniques or general approaches that they can start using immediately? So what I'll present here are 3 of the most popular non-technical guidelines that I typically recommend to groups and organizations. The first is ensuring that images have alternative text. Now, there are some cases when you don't require alternative text, but if the image lends or contributes some information to the page, then you have to ensure that the information captured within that picture is also captured elsewhere on the website via text. And I'll actually review some of this later on in the webinar through my hands-on examples. So we'll get a little more hands-on with that one. It's also important that your page titles are appropriate. A key example is labeling your homepage just home and not including, say, the company name. That's a barrier to someone who's using assistive technology to read out to them the names of the web browsers or the tabs within the web browser they have open. If I land on the Home tab, I have no idea that it's the home page for ABC Code. So it's important to include the company name or whatever else differentiates that home page. And then lastly is to make sure that the text you're using in any links that someone's creating within content is descriptive. And the term descriptive in this case is used to really say, well, if that link were taken out of context, so if I took that link text and removed it from the sentence it's in or the paragraph it's in, does it still have meaning and can I still understand what it said, what it's asking me to do? So a key offender in this space is a link titled "Click Here." When I am using a screen reader to quickly tell me about all the links on the page, a link titled "Click Here" doesn't tell me where I'm going. So that's an example of it. With the incredibly varied landscape of devices and browsers, anywhere from devices that were developed 5 years ago to new browsers that are launched tomorrow, I get asked, well, which browsers should we be designing for to make sure that our content is WCAG 2.0 compliant? What's important in this is to remember that we don't want to design for browsers. We want to design for web standards. So the idea is if my content and my code is designed for HTML standards, JavaScript, CSS, so forth and so on, it's an assumption that it's safe that the browsers who also abide by those standards will be able to understand my content. This becomes even more important when we're in the space of assistive technologies, software that enables extra features within these browsers. But something to keep in mind is if you were planning out your testing procedure, give priority to the most popular browsers on the most commonly used platforms and make your way down to more obscure browsers or older platforms as your resources and time permit. I've used this term a bit in answering some of these FAQ questions, the term assistive technology. What does it mean? In short, you'll see it referred to as AT within some WCAG documentation online. And what an assistive technology is it can either be a piece of software or a hardware device, and this software device extends the functionality of standard software and hardware, and it makes a task that would otherwise be difficult for someone, well, essentially less difficult. So an example of that is a screen reader, which is responsible for verbalizing the content via spoken word to a user who may have a visual disability. And then there's also the concept of a refreshable Braille reader. So that's a hardware device that gets plugged into your computer and is responsible for allowing someone to type using Braille keys, and also convey the information on the website via actuated pins that actually provide the Braille characters for someone to feel tactile. So those are assistive technologies, and there's many different types of software that provide functionality. There's also different types of hardware. Those are two examples of that. Something I hear often is, well, Andre, I can make the content accessible. I can make sure my images have the proper descriptions. I can make sure my links make sense. But what do I do with videos? How do I make sure that my videos on my website are accessible? Well, There are two things that need to be taken into consideration when you're providing accessible videos. The first is to ensure your video has captions. What captions are responsible for is for capturing the auditory information within the media, and in this case it's the video. So it might typically is spoken word in a video, but could include maybe musical lyrics if it's pertinent to what's being heard. And then the other component of accessible video is including a transcript. So whereas the caption was responsible for the auditory information, a transcript is responsible for capturing the visual information. So what I'm seeing, what's occurring, what the environment looks like, what the actors or cast members are doing. And this information is compiled into typically a simple text format. And if I were to be reading this, the transcript typically would read as a screenplay or as a book. So by combining a caption with a transcript, we are removing barriers for those who may have visual disabilities, and we are also removing barriers for those who may have hearing disabilities or even some learning disabilities. Allowing folks to understand the content in the video at their own speed might be appropriate for someone with a learning disability as well. Okay, this is a hot topic. Without a doubt, I can't even count the number of times I've discussed PDF accessibility with organizations. But the first question that comes up is, well, what makes a PDF document accessible? So for a PDF document to be accessible, it's important that we make sure that we have the first understanding that beyond what we're seeing visually in the document, there is a structure behind that content. And that structure is important because it's that structure that provides screen readers and other technologies the ability to understand content. So if you were to take, for example, a Word document, when you have a page title, it's not sufficient to just make that title a larger font. What has to be done is provide a style to that text that marks it as a page title. And then you may have headings on the page. Again, it's not sufficient enough to make those headings a different color or a different font size. You must select the heading style within the styles area, say in Microsoft Word. The same applies for using proper structure for lists, tables, and in the same way that alternative text must be applied to images and web content, it must also be done in Word documents. So my recommendations is if a PDF document is inaccessible and you have the source document, say in Word, work within Word. There are tools and checkers within Word that enable your workflow. If you don't have access to the original source document, but you do have Adobe Acrobat Pro, work within Adobe Acrobat Pro because it also has the ability for you to mark up that structure and tag items. Okay, that was a lot of information. Again, the question area is open. If while we ran through those 9 items, you happen to have any questions, I'd love to see those in the question box within the GoToWebinar control panel. And at the very end of this demo, we'll spend time answering those.
Good. Andre and everybody, can everybody hear me? I had to actually hop off web, like the web audio and onto a phone. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you quite well, Andrew.
Okay, perfect. What I just wanted to do, Andre, if I may, before you dive into this, this section, I want to just preempt this a piece here with everybody. Andre is going to be speaking about specific websites that you're about to see. Just something to note that what Andre is coming from with this section is WCAG 2.0. He's not commenting on if the site's out of compliance with the regulation or not, because in some or many cases, they actually may still be complying with the legislation if it's not a new website after Jan 1, 2014. But it's important that I share that with you so you understand the context. We're showing you sites for your education, so you can actually see real examples. So we kind of have to show sites, and it's from the context of WCAG 2.0. So he will be coming from those guidelines when looking at these modules or features on the website. So I wanted to put that in.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that preamble, Andrew. So I have 10 examples that I'd like to run through. And Andrew, can you see my screen still?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
So what you're seeing here is a web browser. The very first example that I'd like to present is this concept of making sure that your web content has the language it is written in identified on the website. Now, this isn't typically visible to folks on a web browser, but it's very important when it comes to software understanding the language and being able to transmit that information either via sound, so spoken word, or characters to a Braille reader. So the distinction here is that as a human, I'm able to land on this website, understand that I can understand the text on the website, and that would imply to me that it must be English because I understand English. However, when it comes to software, we need to provide them more than that, and more than a hint. It has to be an absolute truth that the software knows this is written in English. I won't get into the underlying structure of this, but know that in order to accomplish this, you must apply a language attribute to the root HTML element. If that makes sense to you, fantastic. Otherwise, you likely don't need to concern yourself with how to solve this, but just be aware that it's important that we do this. And I highlight the Microsoft website here because this website does not actually have the language attribute on the HTML element, so a screen reader would have to guess at the language used for the content here.
And maybe Andre, just for this one, I know for the sake of time we spoke about this, and Andre's not going to go through source code for every one, and it can get a little technical as well. But maybe just for this one, Andre, if you could maybe show source code, just to give an example of where the language attribute would regularly go on the site.
Yeah, absolutely. I love any opportunity to play in the source code, to be honest.
Yeah, we were doing rehearsals yesterday. Andre's spending a lot of time in the source code, and I was like, Andre, man, we gotta let the source code stop back a little bit.
So as Andrew mentioned, this is the source code on the right hand here. This is the structure that's hidden behind what we're seeing. And this very first element at the very top is the root element, and it's considered the HTML element. And so if I was to add the language attribute, I would add an attribute, call it lang, and add en-ca. So now if I was a screen reader and I was reading this content, I'd be like, oh, I know that this is English, and it is regionalized to Canada. So what's really neat is this hint can actually be used to add accents or dialect to languages for these assistive technologies to make the understanding of the content even more appropriate for the listener. So that's kind of neat. And it also actually helps with translation tools. So if my barrier is that I want this content, but I only know French and there's no French site, if I knew it was English, I could use a translation tool to go from English to French. Okay, the next example the next common accessibility issue I'd like to talk about is images within the content that don't have alternate descriptions associated to it. So I talked about this briefly in one of my FAQ questions, and so we'll get a chance to go into more detail here. Certain images on websites lend some information to the content. And what that means is the quick litmus test is remove the image from the website, and if the same information isn't being presented, then I know that that image was contributing to the information. So in this example, I want to highlight this main news article image here. To me, it's pretty clear that there's some information within the image here that actually lends to the heading, hang time, then, now, and forever. What I'd like to know is, well, who is pictured on the left, what's happening in the center, and maybe what trophy they're holding on the right, if I'm looking to learn more about this. So what I would recommend doing is ensuring that that description is included on the image. And that goes a long way to providing more information to someone who is unable to actually visualize the image, someone who might be hearing it or feeling it through a braille or screen reader. Now this guideline is found under section 1.1 of the WCAG 2.0, and it's within guideline 1.1.1. And the previous one, if you'd like to keep some notes, the HTML language is found under section 3.1 of the WCAG version 2.
Okay, moving on now. The next example that I'd like to show is an example of a common error that I see when links are composed of images. So again, as we discussed, when you have an image, you must make sure that the information that's being transmitted via that image is also available in textual form. So that typically means an alt attribute on your image. And this same principle needs to be applied when you have a link that is composed of an image. So in this case, on the National Geographic website, we have a link for the Facebook page and the Twitter page. The way that it's been programmed, I am not being told that this is the Facebook page for National Geographic. I would have to guess what that it is that by listening to a screen reader tell me character by character the URL. So in this case, it would go www.twitter.com/NAT/GEO. So though I could eventually make sense of it, it's not a good user experience, and it doesn't provide someone the same barrier-free web experience that someone who's not using a screen reader would have. So what I propose in this scenario is when you have links that are comprised of images, make sure you have an alt attribute on your image if possible, and if not, place a title attribute that tells me more about what this link is. Now this scenario is found under section 2.4 of the WCAG 2.0, and it is within guideline 2.4.4. Moving on now, we have the City of Windsor website. And on the City of Windsor website, there's a handy search box at the top right, and there's a button titled Go. What I'd like to draw attention to is what happens when I mouse over that Go button. The button changes, so I have a clear indication that there is an action I can perform here, and in this case, it is to perform the search. However, if I was navigating via keyboard, which I might do if I recently sprained my wrist, and I just hit the tab button here, and I tab to the Go button, you'll notice that the state doesn't actually change. So in this case, I don't have the same indication that there's an action here to be performed. So what I would invite you to do in this case is, when there's JavaScript, and in this case there is, make sure that you are paying attention to events related to mouse actions, so moving the mouse, clicking, and such, but also keyboard actions. So for this example, not only using on mouse over and on mouse out, but using on focus and on blur. This scenario can be found under section 2.1 of the WCAG 2.0, and it is under guideline 2.1.1.
Now, the next one that I'd like to highlight is when elements on a website, and in this case I'll highlight links, are made discernible only via color. So for someone who has some level of color blindness, the color blue might look like some shade of gray or black. And if that shade of gray or black is close enough to the color of the standard text on a website, I would not know that that link is actually a link by looking at it. So what I'd like to bring to your attention here is this link beneath the sign-in form says can't access your account. It's a blue link. It's a blue text link. When I mouse over it, I think the blue gets a little bit darker, but it's actually quite negligible. But in this case, the cursor changes, so I know that when I'm over it, I can perform an action. However, if I was colorblind, that may be a shade of gray, and I wouldn't know that I should even put my cursor on top of it. So what's inviting me to do the action in this case? If I'm colorblind, there likely isn't anything. So to rectify this is to use some other indication that this is a link, and typically it would be providing an underline. So I'll simply just add this quickly here. So now what we have is a piece of text that's underlined, which is unlike the rest of the text, so it stands out for a reason and would draw attention to it, and I can know that, oh, this is a link to help me access my account.
We had a client ask a very good question a while back. She said, when I scroll over links in most browsers, it changes, and you can see that in Andre's browser as it shows kind of a pointy arrow if he's not on top of the hyperlink, and then it changes to a hand. And that is correct. That does provide an indicator. But with this guideline, you have to do both. So when you're over that link, you definitely want to have the indicator. But what Andre just provided as an example there was when someone's not over the hyperlink, you still want to have some other indicator other than color that is a hyperlink for the user.
Mm-hmm. And you could italicize your links or bold them if you'd like. Underline is the de facto choice. It's a bit of a web standard, so you know that it's more understandable by the general public. The next typical accessibility issue that I'd like to cover is videos who don't have captions or transcripts. So we're on the NHL website in this case. We're looking at a 1 minute long video of a goal that was scored in the recent NHL Stanley Cup playoffs. And throughout this minute, there are commentators describing the play-by-play. And there may also be environmental noise. There may be some visual information that I can see about where the puck is heading, who's touching it, if there was a rebound, that kind of information. So it's important that for this video to be accessible, that there's a caption that would mimic what the commentators are saying, and that a transcription that describes what I'm seeing. In this case, it's pretty obvious that we don't have a transcript on this page. We have a bunch of thumbnails for videos. Typically, to make sure if there are captions, you have to go into the settings panel of video players. And in this case, this settings panel doesn't actually provide any captions for us. So to be compliant in this case, I would add captions, and I would add a transcript as well. Now, the next example that I'd like to cover is a specific technique that's called using a skip to content link. So if you are someone who's using a screen reader, screen readers read website content very sequentially. It is element by element, left to right, top to bottom. And so what that means is if I'm navigating through the CBC News website, reading different articles, I'm going to get the navigation items in the header, the sign-up links, probably the developing taglines spoken to me over and over and over again every time that I load a new page. After a while, that could be frustrating, a waste of my time, and could seriously degrade my user experience. So what's important to remember is that there are some people who navigate websites sequentially via screen readers or via the tab on their keyboard, so we must make accommodations for them that allow them to skip directly to the content. Because the reality is for folks who are able to see, we can perform this action automatically with our eyes. We just simply look directly to the content, and we barely even realize that there is repeated content that we're overlooking. So in order to provide that to people, we simply add a skip to content link. Now, the important thing here is the CBC website does have it. It would be rather challenging for me to show you someone who doesn't have it and what that looks like, because it just wouldn't have it. So I wanted to show you an example of a website that did it properly. So CBC has this link. However, it's hidden from typical browsers like this Chrome browser or Internet Explorer or Safari. And the reason for that is because it's not really necessary for folks who are using a browser, but it's necessary for screen readers. So how I know it's there is I'll look at the source code. Now we'll just do a search for there. So I'll search for skip. And then what you'll see here is they have this element called accessibility links, and in there is a skip to main content link. It's hidden from us, but it's there for screen readers. And this link is presented at the very start of the content before anything. Okay, the next typical accessibility issue that we run into is with forms. And you have a form that does not tell me up front which fields are required. So the reason why this is important is myself, as someone who is able to use a web browser and fill in forms in a rather straightforward way, it's not always as simple for someone who has, say, a visual disability who's using a screen reader and has a screen reader telling them, oh, the following form field is for your email, the next is for username, then your password, and then you need to actuate the submit button, so you actually submit the form. And for some people, these commands are actually can be done via physical devices. If they have restricted motor access, they might be using a head pointer, which is a device that attaches to your head and allows you to tap the keyboard keys with essentially what looks like a long pencil. So if you combine the fact that folks have motor restrictions and vision restrictions, submitting forms can be very complicated. So it's important that up front we are very explicit in what's expected of someone when they're filling in the form. So in this case, you'll notice that we have 3 form fields: email, username, password, but we're not told that any of them are required until I actually hit create my account, and then the form comes back and tells me that I need to enter values. So this is a usability and accessibility issue, because at this point I may have spent time filling in the form, missed one form field, and now I have to review the form again to see what I missed, and then resubmit the form. So the solution for this is, beside each label, mention that it's required. You can have the text required, or you can put a special character. Typically you'll see the asterisk character, and then make sure that before the form is a legend that describes that form fields marked with an asterisk are required, so that when a screen reader is reading out email asterisk, someone's like, oh, this is a required field, I must fill this in. Okay. Moving on to our final 2 examples. This one is, so in the very first example in the second example that I showed on the NDA website, I mentioned that we should make sure there's a descriptive text for images that don't have any descriptive text. I'd like to elaborate on that one. And so in this example, let's review this image here of the children playing in a pool area. And let's review the alternative text here. So what we have here is the title regent_aquatic_center.jpg. So in this case, there is an alternative description for the image, but it's really not descriptive. It provides me some content. However, a screen reader would not know how to read this because it's one long string and it's not a word. So it would likely read this to me character by character. So what I would propose is just modify the alternative text here to be truly descriptive. So it's one thing to have some text, But if that text is useless, then it doesn't provide any real benefit to someone who's requiring it. So in this case, it would just be Regent Aquatic Center. And you can even go beyond that. You can literally say children playing in the pool at the Regent Aquatic Center. Regent Aquatic Center. This falls under guideline 1.1, same as the example on the NBA website. Why this is even more important is if we review the alternative text on this image of the trees, sometimes our our alt attributes have really obscure character references. So in this case, it says WEDA140250. That would be spoken to someone if they asked the screen reader to tell them more about this image. So it's important that we don't have those obscure characters. Something else I'd like to mention here is certain content management systems fall back. If you don't include an alternative description, it will just populate the alternative description with the file name of the image. So if you happen to name your file name appropriately with spaces, then you can make it a little more accessible. But if your images are titled in these strange ways, then you're no further ahead. So again, that's under section 1.1 in the WCAG 2.0. And then there is the final example that I'd like to cover here. And this is when you have forms on your website with form fields, but there are no labels around that form field that describe to me what this form field is asking me to fill in. So in this case, the Toronto e-update registration form is assuming that I know that this field is for my email. But nowhere around this form input does it actually indicate to me that this is literally like, please put my email address in here. So my recommendation in this case is to add what's called a label element. And this label element will reside in that structural code behind the scenes, and it will link this form field to a label. So it will say, enter your email address. And by doing that, when a screen reader is narrating a form to me, it'll speak out to me that this form field is for my email address. You could argue that it's implied and assumed, but it's important that we assume as little as possible. I recommend not assuming at all, because you're going to have people with various visual abilities or cognitive abilities or even recent motor accidents. So if they may have a broken wrist, they're using an assistive tool to help them navigate the website. It's important that we make sure that they can understand the same information as anybody else. This scenario falls under section 3.3 of the WCAG 2.0. Okay, and that concludes my top 10 most common accessibility issues review. At this point, I think if we head back to the PowerPoint, I'd like to invite every one of you on the call today to head to aodaonline.com. And if you're interested in finding out what accessibility issues your current website has, submit on the main page there. You'll find a form. Please do submit your website URL, and we'll automatically run a free report for you and send you the results.